and he's going to be the next Democratic nominee, and he's going to be the next president.
This is the story of one man who had a dream to become the President of the United States. But one little mistake ruined any chance of that happening. Let's start from the beginning. The year is 2004, and it's an election year in the United States, the time where one person of two parties will become the leader of the American people for the next 4 to 8 years. The Republican nominee has already been selected, George W. Bush running for his second term, but the Democratic nominee has yet to be decided. There are a few potential candidates, such as John Kerry, Wesley Clark, Al Sharpton, Carol Braun, and John Edwards, but one of them stood out from the rest, and is actually the subject of this video. That candidate was a man by the name of Howard Dean. So who is Howard Dean? Well, Howard Dean, real name Howard Brush Dean III, at the time was the governor of Vermont from 1991 to 2003. In the summer of that year, he announced that he would run for President of the United States.
Today I announce that I am running for the presidency of the United States of America.
He promised to provide the American people better health care, balanced budgets, and wanted to restructure the war in Iraq, which began earlier that year.
That I could raise the issues of health care for every American, the need to focus on early childhood development, and I wanted to balance the budget to bring fiscal stability and jobs back to the United States of America. But most importantly, I wanted my party to stand up for what we believe again.
And from the start, things were going really well for him.
He's the guy that really cares about people my age.
He's the only Democrat out there who's actually challenging the president. The rest of them are weak and boring. He's the first person of the candidates that's answering the questions that need to be answered and not afraid to say what needs to be said.
He was supported greatly from the people in his home state. He got support from some of the biggest labor unions in the United States, and was even endorsed by former Vice President and 2000 presidential nominee Al Gore. Not only that, but Howard Dean even became one of the first presidential candidates to use the internet to his advantage to keep in contact with supporters and receive donations from them. With his supporters' help, his campaign managed to raise over $25 million in donations by September of 2003. Throughout the year, he went from state to state, rallying his supporters with his speeches, gaining more ground each time. And by late 2003, things were looking up for Howard Dean, as he had gathered more votes than others, and it seemed likely that he would become one of the top candidates for the Democratic nominee. But he wasn't at the top for long. Other candidates like John Kerry and John Edwards were rising in the polls, and Howard Dean was starting to lose ground. But he wasn't too worried about that. He had his supporters by his side and a go-get-em attitude, and wasn't ready to give up yet. But the first major step for Howard Dean's potential presidency would come up a few months later in January 2004 at the Iowa caucus. Just a few days before the caucus, disaster struck Dean, as he came down with a severe case of the flu. He got better just before the caucus began, but he still has the sniffles, and his voice is a little hoarse. But that didn't stop Howard Dean from giving speeches and rallying his supporters in Iowa. Despite how he felt from before, he was on top of his game until the results came in. Howard Dean finished not first, not second, but third in the Iowa caucus. Great numbers for sure, but it wasn't the results that he, his supporters, or his campaign managers had hoped for. It was a great defeat, but Howard Dean needs to ensure everyone that he hasn't lost yet. That night, at the Valor Ballroom in West Des Moines, Iowa, Howard Dean goes up on stage in front of his supporters to tell them about his loss. And although this might be a setback, this is not the end.
If you had told us 1 year ago that we were going to come in third in Iowa, we would have given anything for that.
The ballroom is filled with over 3,000 people. 3,000 people all cheering and screaming for Howard Dean. It's so loud that he has to use a directional microphone just so viewers at home can hear what he's saying. His voice is still hoarse from the flu earlier, and he has to yell over everyone in order to get his word across. None of that stops him from telling his supporters that he is not going anywhere. And if he is going anywhere, it's going to be to the White House.
You know something? Not only are we going to New Hampshire, Tom Harkin, we're going to South Carolina and Oklahoma and Arizona and North Dakota and New Mexico. We're going to California and Texas and New York. And we're going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House.
But then, Howard Dean makes one little mistake. A mistake that would be used against him. A mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A mistake that would end his campaign right then and there. This is that mistake.
We're going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House.
It might seem ridiculous by today's standards, but this was enough to ruin Howard Dean's presidential campaign. This one little scream that he gave to excite the crowd would be his end. Over the next week, people all over TV and the internet began broadcasting this scene over and over again, to the point where it would become known as the Dean Scream. He would be parodied on the news, on late-night television, and on the internet. He became an early internet meme and would be used in song remixes.
Howard Dean, man, that hoe, he gonna win all the polls. Keep that on the down low. You know he's gonna run for show. Crank that Howard, crank that Dean.
And many years later, the Dean Scream would be used as a sound effect on an episode of Breaking Bad. The scream would be the end for Howard Dean, as a month later in February 2004, he would announce he would be dropping out of the presidential election.
I am no longer actively pursuing the presidency.
Dean's dreams were crushed, all because of one little scream he gave while trying to excite his supporters. But wait a second, I hear you think, I've seen politicians do crazier things like
Wakanda.
Super son of a bitch. Shut up. Watch this drive.
and they got pretty far into their campaigns. It seems ridiculous that something like this would end Howard Dean's chance of becoming president. You can even find plenty of videos on YouTube stating how this ruined his campaign. But was this really the reason for Howard Dean's failure? Yes, but it wasn't the main reason. There's a lot more that led up to Dean's failure than just this scream. Leading up to that awful day, there were people on both sides of the political spectrum that were trying to make Howard Dean look like an imperfect candidate for president. He was at the top where others wanted to be, and they wanted to bring him down for their own gain.
Look, this was a presidential campaign, so both sides are going to use whatever tools in their toolbox against their opponent.
And how they did this was by taking his segments from his speeches and show them without context. Howard Dean gave many impassionate speeches throughout his campaign, and to the people who don't follow along with all political candidates, Howard Dean might come off as a bit angry.
All those workers are going to send this president back to Crawford, Texas.
Ill-tempered.
I don't want to listen to the fundamentalist preachers anymore.
Maybe even unhinged.
Go to hell!
So to many people, this was their first introduction to Howard Dean as a candidate. But not only did he have a bad first impression with some potential voters, he also didn't come in first at the Iowa caucus. As mentioned earlier, Howard Dean finished third at the Iowa caucus, and the Iowa caucus is the first major contest for selecting presidential candidates. It's important because the people who get the highest votes here are usually the ones who have a greater chance of becoming the presidential nominee. In fact, most people who finish in the top 2 in their respective parties at the Iowa caucus are usually the ones who go on to be selected to be the presidential nominee. Let me show you some examples. At the 2000 Iowa caucus, the top 2 Republican winners were George W. Bush and Steve Forbes, and the top 2 Democratic winners were Al Gore and Bill Bradley, and the presidential nominees that year were George W. Bush and Al Gore. At the 2008 Iowa caucus, the Republican winners were Mike Huckabee and Mitt Romney, the Democratic winners were Barack Obama and John Edwards. The presidential nominees that year were Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. At the 2012 Iowa caucus, the Republican winners were Rick Santorum and Mitt Romney. The Democratic nominee was Barack Obama with little to no opposition. The presidential nominees that year were again Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. At the 2016 Iowa caucus, the Republican winners were Ted Cruz and Donald Trump, and the Democratic winners were Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. The presidential nominees that year were Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And at the 2004 Iowa caucus, where this story takes place, the Republican winner was George W. Bush with no opposition, and the Democratic winners were John Kerry and John Edwards. The presidential nominees that year were George W. Bush and John Kerry. Of course, this isn't always the case, as some people who don't finish in the top 2 can make a comeback. For example, and this is the last time I'll do this, at the 2020 Iowa caucus, the Republican winners were Donald Trump and Bill Weld, and the Democratic winners were Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders. And the presidential nominees that year were Donald Trump and Joe Biden, despite the fact that Biden finished 4th at the Iowa caucus. So he was able to become nominee despite a bad start. Maybe Howard Dean could have done the same thing. Well, according to Dean himself, those chances were slim to none.
There are those who believe I could have recovered in New Hampshire, and I might have, but you never know.
Since the scream, Howard Dean has been very open about what happened on that fateful day. And in his own words, he said that his scream was not the reason for his failure. The real reason for his failure was due to poor organization. He and his campaign managers raised a lot of money from their supporters leading up to the Iowa caucus. Money that would not be used properly compared to other candidates. In his own words, "I was a flawed and undisciplined candidate. Our campaign was in disarray. And because of that, our Iowa operation was unable to capitalize on my early popularity." He and his managers would go on to state that this, along with coming in 3rd at the Iowa caucus, was the real reason for his failure. Also, it is worth mentioning that Howard Dean did have some controversial opinions.
I was the only one running for president who stood up against the war in Iraq.
Howard Dean came here believing his anti-war stance would propel him. It was far down.
This might sound strange today, but that was a controversial opinion back in the day. Controversial opinions, poor organization, and losing the Iowa caucus all led to him losing his early popularity, while the negative publicity that he got from his scream and how people used it against him is what cemented Dean's failure. But if anything, this should go to show you how much politics has changed since then. We've seen plenty of politicians today do and say ridiculous things, and they still got pretty far into their campaigns. Back then, something like this would have been the end for a politician. But today, this could be used in their advantage. Memes would be spread all over the internet, bringing more attention to Howard Dean, just like the memes we see with politicians today. And if Dean and his campaign managers did things properly, they could have used this attention to bring him further into the presidential race. But if this were to happen today, could Dean have used weaponized memes to win the election, and we all could have had a President Dean? Most likely not. In my opinion, Howard Dean would have ended up like Bernie Sanders, someone who was memed on throughout their entire presidential campaign, who got pretty far into the race, but in the end didn't win. The same thing would have happened to Howard Dean, in my opinion. Due to the circumstances mentioned earlier, it would have been close, but he wouldn't have won. So, what's Howard Dean been up to now? Well, in 2005, he was elected chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and he continued to serve with them until January 2009, when he officially retired from politics. But he would still continue to endorse Democratic nominees in elections afterwards. In 2015, he went to work for Dentons, a global law firm, and there have been some rumors about him getting back into politics. But more importantly than that, he has come to embrace the Dean Scream meme, it seems.
This race is going to be won on the ground, and it's going to be won in Colorado, and in Iowa, and North Carolina, and Michigan, and Florida, and Pennsylvania, and then we're going to the White House.
And That's the story of Howard Dean, the man, the meme, and the nominee. A nominee that continues to be talked about and researched more than 20 years later, which is more that can be said than other nominees from the time. Howard Dean might have lost the election, but he certainly hasn't lost our attention.
Can you give us one scream to end it all off?
No.
You don't want to do it?
No, because that's the part of television I don't like, so we're not doing that.